Now let's look at a second logic model, this one for permanent supportive housing. The intended outcome of permanent supportive housing is that people who are now chronically homeless will be in stable housing and will have improved health and welfare. The theory is that placing people in permanent housing with wraparound health and social services will lead to these results. And now let's take a look at the logic model for permanent supportive housing. Once again, let's look at the outcomes, which are essentially the intended impact statement. The outcomes are that previously homeless people have permanent housing, that there are improvements in their health and reduction in substance abuse, better chances of employment, better quality of life generally. There's a reduction of their use in emergency services and a reduction in incarceration. Once again, the input side is the same. In this case, the activities and outputs involve how we get people into permanent supportive housing and keep them there. So what's critical if you look at the outputs is we obtain units, housing units for people, and after putting them there, we provide intensive case management to give them the social services and mental health services they need to stay there. So if you compare this logic model for permanent supportive housing to the logic model for street interventions, you'll see quite a few similarities. But in order to achieve the outcome here, which is placing people in permanent housing, there are additional steps besides outreach. There's a requirement, for example, of obtaining the housing units and then helping voluntarily move the homeless people into those and keep them there. Now let's turn to our third strategy, which is preventing people from becoming homeless to begin with. The intended impact of this approach is to prevent families who are at risk of losing their homes from actually being evicted. The interventions include helping them pay their bills, helping them pay their rent, various ways of avoiding eviction, and the goal, of course, is to avoid evictions. And now let's turn to the logic model for this. And you'll notice in this logic model, I've created a new column for intermediate outcomes as well as ultimate outcomes. If you look at ultimate outcomes on the right, you'll see that it is to prevent individuals and families at risk of homelessness from being evicted. But in order to get there, there's an intermediate outcome. This is something beyond what the organization itself can do. It's what the organization hopes that its activities and outputs will produce. It'll result in rent and bills being paid, in health and drug problems being reduced, in better personal financial management, in better employment. And now we look at the activities and outputs that lead to those intermediate outcomes and hopefully to the ultimate outcomes. The activities involve identifying at-risk individuals and families who have characteristics that predict homelessness. For example, childhood poverty, being pregnant or having an infant, current domestic violence, overcrowding, doubling up, frequent moves. All of these have been shown to be good predictors that somebody is likely to be evicted. And then identify individuals who fit those characteristics. The outputs are to provide services to them in various ways: short-term cash assistance, rent subsidies, legal services to prevent eviction, and providing the same kinds of services we provided in the other situations: health, substance abuse, mental health, and as well as budget counseling and job training. This is a more complicated set of activities and outputs in order to lead to the intended impact of avoiding eviction, because it requires, in addition to providing the services, identifying people who are not yet homeless but are at risk. But the theory of change here is that if these steps are taken, it will lead to the intermediate outcomes and then to the ultimate outcomes of reducing the likelihood of being evicted. Why create a logic model? The logic model, as I said, is fundamentally a recipe for how your organization is going to achieve its outcomes. There are some people who can just whip up a dish before dinner without any recipe at all. Achieving social change of the sort that your organizations are trying to accomplish really requires much thought. You're not following somebody else's recipe, but you're following one that you have carefully designed. As we'll see in a later class, the logic model provides a framework for assessing organizational performance. Have you engaged in the activities? Have you achieved the outputs and outcomes that the logic model calls for? If not, it's an opportunity to take stock, to understand why you're not achieving the targets you've set for yourself, to make course corrections, and then to move on toward a successful outcome. That concludes our introduction to logic models, using homelessness as an example. And now, for your assignment, I would like you to turn to childhood obesity. I'd like you to draft a logic model to address childhood obesity based on one of the three intended impact statements. You can use any one of the ones you want, and its theory of change that we discussed in the last class. Begin by using the intended impact statement as the ultimate outcome at the right side of your logic model, and then fill in the necessary inputs and activities and outputs, and if necessary, intermediate outcomes to achieve the ultimate outcome. Remember that each stage of the logic model should be causally related to the next one. In our next class, we're going to look at the logic models we've developed so far and identify weaknesses in them, and also identify problems that may occur when we implement them.